George Michael is one of the most talented songwriters and performers of his generation. Throughout his 25-year career, he has been the driving force behind one of the biggest bands of the 1980s. He has sold over 80 million albums as a solo performer and gathered numerous awards along the way. However, controversy and scandal have often threatened to overshadow his musical achievements. No more so than on the afternoon of the 7th of April, 1998, when he was arrested in the Will Rogers Memorial Park in Beverly Hills and almost lost everything.
Nothing to lose.
Leads you to where you are today.
I believe in storytelling.
It's gonna make you a star.
I'm still trying to figure that out.
Beverly Hills police officers arrested the singer known as George Michaels. Mr. Michaels was arrested for a violation of 647A of the Penal Code, engaging in a lewd act.
In a way, it's the best thing that ever happened to me. What I was embarrassed by was the kind of stupidity of it. And then it took me a long while to realize it wasn't just plain stupidity. There was an undercurrent of real self-destruction there. And it takes a long time to admit to yourself that you've kicked your own quite hard, you know. But all very, very good learning stuff, and very much, and as I've said many times since, being publicly humiliated does have its advantages, because it kind of, there aren't many things more embarrassing than that. Fish and chip shop, and I think by the time I was about 1.5, we'd done better. We were living above the laundrette then. When I was very young, my mother and father were struggling quite badly. By the time I was, I guess, 12 or 13, I lived in a nice big house out in the suburbs, but my very early life was right bang in the centre of North London.
George's father, Jack, had arrived from the Greek island of Cyprus just 10 years earlier, full of dreams and ambition, but completely penniless. He found a job in a local restaurant and was soon working 7 days a week to support his growing family.
I never took anything for granted, and my father was incredibly tight with his money, so I certainly never, even when we got into the nice big house, I still had to work for everything, which is really a good place to start, I think.
George's family was not musical, but a gift of some records kick-started his interest.
I was given 3 45s, and one of them was Tom Jones singing Delilah. One of them, and the other 2 were the Supremes. And one of those 2 records had a big, was broken, so I had a big bit missing. So I used to lift up the stylus and put it down on the other side of the record, let it turn around and go like that. That was how I learned the record. But yeah, my Supremes, and I've always said you must be very influenced by music that you hear when you're very young, because I ended up somewhere in between the Supremes and Tom Jones anyway, didn't I, really?
He said to me that he felt that he had been born out of time, that he should have been an artist in the 70s during the singer-songwriter era.
Not content with just listening to music, it wasn't long before George tried his hand at writing.
The writing has been a constant thing since I was a child. The believing I was going to be a pop star didn't happen until a bit later, I suppose. The music maker of the world, yes, that was my very first song. And I do remember the melody and the lyrics, but I shan't be giving them to you right now. I played drums on the pillows in my mate's house, and he played the guitar. But it was actually quite catchy.
At his local comprehensive school, George met Andrew Ridgeley. This confident classmate provided a new focus for the budding singer.
I often wonder if I had not bumped into Andrew, you know, how different my life would have been, because he was determined he was going to be famous. I think he would have been just as happy to be a footballer, but he was determined to be famous. And at the end of our school days, as it were, 5 years later, it was him that encouraged me to start a band as early as we did, you know.
And that band was called The Executive.
Absolutely dreadful school band. We had one little amplifier that we all used to plug into, and the rehearsal would last as long as the amp didn't smoke, and then the amp would start to smoke, because we had 2 microphones, a bass guitar and a rhythm guitar, stuck into this tiny little amp, and it would literally just start to smoke.
The Executive came out of sort of ska. They were rather stylized. They were sort of cheap man's Duran Duran in a way. They were new romantics. I think, you know, it's just as well that they didn't make it as the Executive, because it allowed them to come up with something that was a lot more authentic.
The Executive failed to ignite any interest from the record industry and promptly disbanded. But George and Andrew were not to be put off and immediately started working as a duo, taking the name Wham. It wasn't long before they caught the attention of Mark Dean at Innervision Records, who encouraged them to sign a contract.
The signing of the Innervision contract was one mostly of naivety. In a Greasy Spoon cafe in North London, the boys met Mark Dean, who insisted they must sign the contract there and then, otherwise it won't happen. They signed it. It was, with hindsight, one of the most ludicrous contracts you could ever imagine. If they were ever to make any money out of it, it would be a minor miracle.
The original deal with Innervision Records, we got, I think it was 1.5p a single, and 12 inches we got nothing at all. And of course we were selling 50% 12 inches, I would imagine, at the time.
The first mention of George Michael in my life was by Mark Dean, who ran this little label called Innervision, and he said, I've signed an act that you're going to love, and they're going to be huge. And they're called Wham. And I said, they're called Wham. He said, yes, they're called Wham.
They were starting to get noticed on the UK music scene, but what was it about Wham that made them stand out from the competition?
I think, to be honest with you, great songs and, you know, a formula that we didn't realise we had, you know. These two young boys doing this kind of Butch Cassidy and Sundance thing, but in a very kind of camp way. And I think there was something about the fact that it was all very obvious that our relationship as friends was real. There was some kind of chemistry between us that we absolutely hadn't counted on, you know. But the world seemed to see pretty quickly.
I think the Wham sound of the day was modern because it was different. It just sounded fresh and new, and if you were, you know, 30-odd, which I was then, it sounded young. It made you feel old, which in a way is exactly what pop music always should do.
There was something catchy about them, these two guys, and, you know, the style they had and the mullets and everything else. I thought it was pretty cool.
By the start of the 1980s, George Michael's band Wham had secured a record contract. As a teenager, George Michael pined for pop stardom and had formed a duo with school friend Andrew Ridgeley, named Wham. The pair soon had a record contract, but found themselves attached to a small label in less than favorable circumstances. Their first release, Wham Rap, scraped into the top 50.
Weren't an instant #1 with their first record, and they benefited from a very, very unusual situation, which was that someone dropped out of Top of the Pops.
I was obsessed with Top of the Pops. I remember sitting talking to someone in a classroom when I was about 8 and asking them what Top of the Pops looked like in colour, because they had a colour TV and we didn't have a colour TV yet.
Once they got to do the Wham thing on national TV, then whoosh, away we go.
It's my first Top of the Pops, and it's their first Top of the Pops. Wham!
I remember getting there and thinking, my God, it's tiny. Because actually it looked so big on TV, but actually it was 4 stages directly opposite each other at the time, in a tiny room, so that crowd could look like a big crowd and just keep shuffling backwards and forwards in that small space.
Well, I haven't seen your face around town in a while.
This is it. This is what we've waited for all this time. Because even by then, it was, I don't know, 11 years of dreaming, even though I was only 18. And, yeah, what a fantastic thing to, you know, especially with your best friends, to achieve your dream, you know, as a teenager. I used to walk up and down Oxford Street hoping people would recognise me, which seems so laughable now, because now I've mastered the art of walking really fast in a baseball cap with my head down like that.
Even though their second single, Young Guns, climbed to #3 in the UK charts, Wham were virtually penniless due to their hastily signed contract that offered them little in the way of royalties. So armed with a new manager, Simon Napier Bell, they decided to take the matter to court. Successfully contesting the terms of the contract, they won their release from Intervision and signed to Epic Records. With their legal wrangling over, Wham could set their sights on more chart success. Every release saw the duo climbing higher in the charts, and Wham mania hit both sides of the Atlantic, when Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go became their first US #1.
It wasn't till Go-Go that it all kind of exploded. But I remember thinking, oh, it's going to happen soon anyway. You know, it will happen soon. There was no reason to think it wouldn't. Everything was successful that came out of England at the time, and I thought we were better than most of what was coming out. So as far as I was concerned, it was just a matter of time, you know.
The group's heartthrob image and infectious sound were a winning combination.
Who was not a fan of Wham? I mean, that was really a group that took the US by storm and, of course, took the UK by storm, but how could you not love Wham?
George was the musical mind behind Wham, writing and singing virtually all the pair's hits. But what of his partner, Andrew Ridgeley?
Where Andrew has always been underrated was the support that he gave George, the confidence he gave George more than anything else.
You know, Andrew thought of outfits and clothes and things like that, and the whole part of the look, and, you know, so yeah, he contributed.
You know, the Choose Life T-shirts and the big white T-shirt with letters, you know, they definitely stood out.
Just because he's not the best guitar player in the world, you know, just, you know.
We almost morphed into one person in some ways in our late teens. We had exactly the same sense of humour, we had our own kind of language, and it was all part of what was keeping me inspired to write songs with that kind of energy to them. It was, our relationship was very much part of that, and there's no question that the fact that women loved him obviously helped the group a great deal, you know.
Professional accolades were flooding in for George. He became the youngest recipient of the Ivor Novello Award for songwriting. But as a duo, Wham still wanted to become the biggest band in the world, and their manager had a master plan.
Wham Go to China, great piece of 1980s marketing.
It was dreamt up by Simon Napier Bell as the ultimate publicity stunt, something destined to take them out of Britain, or from Britain, and make them an internationally known band overnight. And it's exactly the effect it had.
People were suddenly, if you didn't know who Wham was before, you knew after that, absolutely.
It was so amazing to go then. It was 1985, so they were the first band ever to be allowed in. And literally, they'd only allowed music in a year before that.
They wouldn't let people clap or dance or do anything at the concerts. People were dragged out of the concerts for dancing.
I've never played Wake Me Up Before You Go-Go, and I could hear a pin drop. It was very, very quiet. It was me and you could have a conversation that we're having right now, and it was the weirdest feeling, because I remember, you know, we're trying to get into it, and everybody's jumping around, and I'm going, my, this is awful quiet.
After I realised that it was all kind of a bit of a pretense, I stopped meeting with the dignitaries and stuff, because the first week we were shaking hands with, you know, various people from the government, but I stopped all that once I realised that we were actually, it was a bit of a sham. You know, and politically we were still there in a very strange circumstance. But no, fascinating, and I'd love to go back and see what it's like now, actually. It would be really interesting.
On paper, everything looked bright. Wham had a string of #1 hits under their belt on both sides of the Atlantic. Wham had made George Michael one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. But was that really what he wanted? Michael was one of the biggest names in pop music. Along with partner Andrew Ridgeley, they had a string of hits around the world. But in 1986, at the peak of their success, George was getting itchy feet.
I was 22, 23. It's amazing how old you feel at 23. You think you're so adult. And I felt as though, you know, it was going to start becoming a bit of a sham, because Andrew and I didn't spend anything like as much time. By then he'd moved for tax reasons to Monaco. So we hadn't seen as much of each other. It was getting to be much less of a relationship than a working relationship. And also I was starting to write things that I felt just didn't fit into the Wham category. And I took myself much more seriously at 23 than I do at 44. So I wanted other people to, I think.
Wham was great, but, you know, I'm sure that, you know, he had so many things inside him that he wanted to express, that that was a right move to make.
George had to go solo.
I suspect that the moment that George felt completely relaxed and confident and knew he could do it all on his own is when he picked up the Ivor Novello Award.
In 1984, George had tested the ground with his solo single, Careless Whisper, which was a worldwide #1. It was undoubtedly the first sign that George was considering breaking up one of the biggest bands in the world. And in 1986, that's exactly what he did.
Andrew and I had always said, you know, we're going to go when we're on top, and, you know, before it turns into any kind of self-parody. And luckily, I was unhappy enough unhappy enough with being where I was. And yeah, thank God it didn't last long enough to turn into self-parody. I think we left people wanting more, you know.
Wham went out with a bang, with a final concert at London's Wembley Stadium in front of a sold-out audience of 72,000 screaming fans, and one George Michael lookalike.
Yeah, to anyone who's not here
especially the people who didn't manage to get tickets, you know, we'd love to have seen everyone off personally, but can't do it.
With no regrets about splitting up. So a huge thank you to everyone, not only today, but for the last 4 years.
Now, Andrew pretended to throttle me, didn't he, I think? Yeah, I think, in all honesty, Andrew knew that we were just about to make a fortune in America. And, but I knew that meant living something I was no longer happy with for a good another 18 months, you know. And Andrew was very gracious about it, I have to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the last 4 years.
I think we left it exactly where it was supposed to be left, really.
Inevitably, maturity wins out, and you let go of the things of youth. And Wham was a thing of George Michael's youth.
But emotional maturity was still something George was coming to terms with. He was grappling with both personal and professional matters. While searching for a way to distance himself from his pop past, he bumped into legendary producer Clive Davis.
I had gone to a British award show, and George Michael was just getting out of Wham. He said, I want to do a duet with Aretha Franklin.
I talked to Clive, and Clive had liked my work and really wanted to put me together with Aretha, so it was perfect.
Here's an artist coming out of a group that people thought were a little lightweight. Big hits, big sales, had broken China, had toured, but not the credibility. How do you get, from his point of view, do you get credibility instantly if an artist like Aretha Franklin will stamp you, support you, be associated with you?
Clive Davis enlisted the help of Grammy Award winner Narada Michael Walden to produce the record at his California studio.
For me, in this room, George the first day, Aretha the second day, and then toward the end of her day, then George would come back and they'd wrap it up. Well, on George's first day, George sang beautifully. His first couple takes were the record. But then he wanted to keep going to the point where we were out of tracks. And George wasn't used to being produced. George produced everything for himself. I said, come in the control room. And I said, George, man, I'm out of tracks, and I've got your first stuff, which I think is brilliant, and this last stuff you've done, which is also brilliant. He said, well, go over the early stuff. I said, no, I can't. That's our records. So I said, just trust me, I'll put it together, and it'll be great. And he did. But, you know, he kind of looked at me like, So Aretha comes next day, and she's all excited. She hears George's part. She's excited. She goes and does her bits kind of quick, and then we put them together. And, man, that's when fireworks really went crazy. George was on his A game. She's, of course, always bringing her A game. And she was kind of being, I think, conscious not to scare him. But then she couldn't help herself. She just reared back and went crazy. And it's on the record. It's on the record. Yeah, she loved him. She loved him, and he loved her. And we loved each other.
The single with Aretha seemed to give people enough separation between Wham and George Michael that it made the whole transition into faith a lot easier.
With the love fest of I Knew You Were Waiting for Me topping the charts around the world, George found the self-motivation to start writing again. And he was soon back in the studio, recording a new album, which was to be his biggest yet.
Wham was just a warm-up for the Faith album.
He was already a big star, but it really catapulted him over the top. I mean, that was an absolute phenomenon. It really made him a bona fide A-list celebrity.
I couldn't imagine being much more famous than I was in Wham, so I hadn't really experienced American fame on the level that it was, you know, possible. So I didn't realize, and then of course it went into overdrive with Faith.
Great to see it all come together. You know, that was a really fantastic time.
just clicked in a way that I wasn't expecting, and it kind of exploded.
It was a good album, and I think it was a lot more substantial than what people were expecting from someone from Wham, both in terms of him really establishing his own character and in terms of the sound of the music. It was a much richer sound.
You know, Faith could have quite ridiculously have been the third Wham album, as it were, almost, you know, because I think it would have... The songs were strong enough that even if the image had seemed a bit strained by then, we would have got away with it, you know, but it didn't. Obviously, I didn't want that to happen.
It was an extraordinary success. 12 million copies sold in the United States. And he really was one of the handful of biggest artists in the world.
Faith spawned no less than 4 Billboard #1s and stayed in the charts for a year. And along with the album came a new image.
That image just seemed to click, you know. The other thing is, I suppose, I put a guitar on, which is a big kind of phallic symbol to Americans especially.
I will always wonder what was going on in his head when he made that front cover. To me, it looks like he's sniffing his armpit. I don't know what an alternative explanation could be. You don't have a pose like that by accident.
Faith's success was backed up with a grueling tour and promotion schedule, which steadily took its toll.
It was too giddy for me, you know. It really was, and I couldn't handle, just really couldn't handle the intensity of it. Your life changes, you know, your lifestyle changes. I was very scared of all of that. You know, I was really scared of all of this new power, in a way. It was too much. It was more than I'd expected at 24, put it that way.
The whole Faith process of promotion, videos, tours, and awards had left George completely exhausted. And one question was dominating the gossip columns and clubs. Was the biggest recording star in the world about to quit? Michael had disbanded Wham at the peak of their success and had become one of the biggest artists in the world with the release of the album Faith. But the exhausting process of promotion and touring had been testing for him, and more personal matters were starting to come to the fore.
By then I realized that I wasn't bisexual, I was gay. And I'd really come to that realization right at the beginning of the whole Faith period, you know. So that was weighing on me very heavily by then, because I didn't, you know, I wasn't a liar, but I was in a situation where I was so high profile. And on top of that, I think I was struggling with the beginnings of depression, which is in my family, but I didn't acknowledge that it might be something actually chemical for many years.
George started writing his second solo album, Listen Without Prejudice. Naturally, for one of the biggest artists in the world, the anticipation was immense. But when the record was released in 1990, George, still scarred by the Faith promotion experience, decided to take a back seat.
When I heard that George wasn't going to be active in the promotion of Listen Without Prejudice, I just thought, uh-oh.
I could have toured again and really, really taken it somewhere really silly in terms of fame and money. But at the time, that was just terrifying to me. So I kind of went into hiding for about 6 or 7 years, which was obviously not helped by a 3-year court case, blah, 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 blah. But it was absolutely essential. I think it's one of the reasons I'm still sane today.
Hampered by the lack of promotion, Listen Without Prejudice only sold 4 million copies, a fraction of Faith's 12 million. Relations with his record company Sony became strained and reached breaking point when George decided to take them to court, claiming that the contract he had signed as a teenager effectively handcuffed him to the record label for the rest of his career. George wanted out, and the David and Goliath court case commenced in London's High Court in October 1993.
The law is on the side of who's legally right. And Sony had George pretty well wrapped up.
I'd always known, and everybody knew, that there was a huge discrepancy in the business between where these contracts had come from, which was the 30s, and the deals with Paramount and then CBS and studio deals, basically. And they were made in the same way, whereby artists were owned lock, stock and barrel by the record company.
The music business had changed, the contracts hadn't. So fairness demanded that Sony release George from this contract.
I mean, Sony is Sony, and going up against them was both brave and stupid. I mean, it's just the way that it is. But he felt that he was being pushed into a corner and he wasn't going to take it anymore.
He
fought for what he believed in. And that you can't put any person down for going for what they believe in. If you feel that strong about something, you know, then you have to go for it.
I understood that George had been provoked by a slur from an American record executive. And if indeed what I had heard was true, then anybody would want to be off the label.
The winner-takes-all case lasted an incredible 2 years.
I lost everything, absolutely lost disastrously, and I genuinely will never believe that that was kosher.
I am shocked and extremely disappointed at the judgment of Mr. Justice Parker. There is no such thing as resignation for an artist in the music industry.
If the law had been properly followed, I would have won my case. You know, restraint of trade. You can't sign people for 30 years to, you know.
In the end, the case was resolved in a way that most of us in the business thought it would be. That is to say, George did not get released, but Sony wanted to release him. Because nobody wants to have an unhappy artist on the list, an artist who's going to make the air foul. We all remember Prince saying at the Berlin MTV Awards, "God bless George Michael." George had become a symbol of independence. Artists supported him. What an embarrassment to Sony. Sure, they were legally correct, but they were embarrassed by having him.
All it really did was absolutely blacklist me here in America and take 3 years out of my career in the rest of the world. Would I have been clever not to do it? Yes, but if I had not done these things, I would have remained very, very high profile in America, and I would have had to go through everything I went through in full glare. So, you know, terrible, terrible period of my life, but all, you know, like everything else, you learn great lessons from it, you know.
George was signed to a new label, but still took 3 years to release his next album, Older. Older was a mature and pensive work, but unfortunately proved another commercial disappointment. Its sales clearly hampered by his long hiatus away from performing. However, all this seemed inconsequential when George's beloved mother, Leslie, suddenly fell ill with an aggressive strain of cancer. Tragically, Leslie died shortly after her diagnosis, and George broke down completely.
That was more of a loss than I could ever have believed, and it kind of came out of nowhere. So yeah, I felt quite sorry for myself for a bit, you know. I was not really, I was not a happy puppy for a while.
I did call him then and try to talk to him at that time, but it was very hard to even, at that time, hold a conversation. That things had gotten so out of hand, and rightly so, you know.
I always think that life is divided into two sets of people who have lost and people who haven't yet, you know. And the day that you lose, really lose, is the day you become an adult, a real, true adult.
George Michael had been one of the biggest stars in the world, but after 2 disappointing albums, a court case, and the untimely death of his mother, was this the end? In the 1980s, George Michael was one of the most successful artists in the world, thanks in no small part to his Faith album, which had sold an enormous 12 million copies. However, his next 2 albums had been commercial disappointments. He also lost a high-profile court case, and tragically, his mother passed away. At the age of 34, George Michael was on a downward spiral, but more difficult personal issues were to follow.
Within the industry, George's sexuality was very well known.
It was an open secret that he was gay. But there were a lot of people who did not know, and it came as a bit of a shock.
I think one thing that needs to be said is that George didn't hide the fact that he was gay any more than entertainers had done for generations. There's a great English tradition, and I think American tradition as well, with film stars, Rock Hudson and others. People didn't ask you about your sexuality, so you didn't talk about it.
I wasn't a liar, but I was in a situation where I was so high profile, and by then I was already had an absolute hatred of the kind of tabloid press. So it was all getting very complicated. I didn't like the idea that they had something like that over me because they knew I was gay.
It's unfair to expect somebody to be out publicly when they are not yet out at home. And it took a while for George to be out at home because he came from this Greek macho man background. So he had to get through that, but he didn't get through it on a schedule with when I have my first hit record. I mean, that's a different thing.
In fact, it took him 27 years to have his first serious relationship. His partner was Anselmo Feleppa. Sadly, Anselmo passed away just 2 years into their relationship.
What can I say, really? Beautiful man, beautiful heart, terrible loss. It was 2 years. It was pretty shocking because obviously I'd waited until I was 27 to have my first proper relationship, and within 6 months, I knew he was terminally ill. So it was a very shocking time. Never been so scared in my life. The fear of him dying was far greater than the grief. You know what I mean? But incredible lessons learnt, and 2 years of being with someone who was truly wonderful, beautiful person to learn those lessons from.
When you've never had a partner, to have a partner is uplifting beyond description. You could see that, from George's perspective, Anselmo merited the beautiful tributes that George paid to him in the songs after his death. I have to say, Jesus to a Child is one of the most beautiful songs of mourning ever recorded.
It was just mind-blowing for him. I think it was, one of the hardest things he'd ever had to come across in his whole life. And I don't know if you ever really get over things like that. I mean, you get used to it and you learn to deal with it. So, the loss of anybody, a loved one, a parent, anything like that is always, tough.
So, incredibly lucky to have met him. That's the way I look at it. And I wish it had been earlier. I wish I'd been myself earlier in life, but, better late than never.
Despite Anselmo's death hitting the headlines, George remained tight-lipped about his sexuality. However, something astonishing happened in Los Angeles in 1998 that made dodging the topic no longer possible. George was arrested for lewd behavior in a public toilet.
I don't think anybody was prepared for the exhibition in Los Angeles. I think that was a surprise.
It was like a double shock to the public to find that somebody that, a celebrity of that caliber was doing something like that.
It was, in every way, a setup, including me. That's the funny part. I was setting myself up as well. That's the funny part. There was collusion between my own anger and kind of mental anguish at losing my mother by that point, and collusion between that and all my feelings of anger and guilt, and collusion, as far as I was concerned, and I will always believe, between the police and the newspapers, and a few other people, unfortunately. But again, for some reason, I'm not intended to have a quiet life.
When George released his next single, Outside, he showed he had a sense of humor about the incident, with the accompanying video featuring disco dancing police officers. However, the arresting officer did not find it quite so amusing.
The cop tried to sue me for mental anguish, because, of course, nothing goes on in Los Angeles of that enormity, no pun intended. Yeah, he sued me for mental anguish. And I love that video. I do love that video. I won't say it was worth getting arrested to make the video. Maybe for the song. And actually, if you saw the response during the show, because it's one of the highlights of the show, is me coming out in my police gear, And I suppose all those nights that people have enjoyed it night after night on stage, listening to Outside or going crazy to it, maybe it was worth it, Maybe it was worth it.
In another headline-grabbing move, George announced that his next album, Patience, would be his last record on sale to the public, and future releases would be available for free download only.
Well, actually, what I said was it would be available for free or for charitable donation if people wanted to. And the actual truth is nobody donated anything, so I kind of withdrawn the idea, as it were. I mean, what I've said and what I still believe is that in order to make my life work for me in an industry which is falling apart, I think the things that I want to say are those things that I still have to say. I think are out of place now in the medium of pop. So I think I might have to look for other avenues in which to write. Because I'm not who I was even 5 years ago. I've got some brand new ideas now, and and I want them to be of some use. I've always believed that my creativity is with me for a reason, you know, and that always wanting to have a positive effect in life with what you create is something that is hard to give up. You know, even though it'd be lovely to be self-indulgent, I do really believe that there's a reason that I was given this gift. And it doesn't just have to be in my voice. You know, it's about things I want to say, you know. So we'll see that the future is very open for me. But I think, having been hugely disappointed by people's charitable inclinations, let's say, lack of charitable inclinations, I think if I wanted to make money for charity, I'd have to go about releasing, you know, a song in the regular way and just giving the money away.
Never afraid to adapt, George Michael spent the first 10 years of his career turning himself into a pop icon. He then spent the next decade trying to work out how to be true to himself. After 20 years in the limelight, would he finally be able to lay his demons to rest? In the 1980s, George Michael was a superstar of the highest order, but the 90s were much tougher for him professionally and personally. In 2008, he's set to surprise his public yet again, with an acting role in the new U.S. drama, Eli Stone, in which each episode is named after one of his songs.
Eli Stone is very, very exciting because I've finally had a chance to act, which is something that I could always do as a child, or I thought I could do as a child, and other people thought I could do as a child, but I'd presumed that that ability leaves. Looking at the other actors and actresses, not mentioning any names, but looking at other actors and actresses from the music industry, one presumes that you just get so self-conscious of your persona that you can't do it anymore. I just presumed. I was terrified the first day, so terrified, because it's so unusual for me to walk out onto a set or a stage and be the only person there that doesn't know what the hell they're doing. You know, it's really, that's not my normal, it's been a while, you know. So I was absolutely terrified, and it showed, I think, on the first day. And then they were so lovely to me when I came in on the second day. Mind you, the thing is, I did say up front to the director, I said, I know you're not going to be expecting anything from me, and I know you're going to be terrified that I'm crap, but please don't just give me a few words to say here and there, because I don't know what to do with that. You know, I really won't know what to do with "How are you?" You know, or please give me a bit of dialogue. So, but anyway, they tried to ease me in the first day, and it really was. It was a matter of sitting around 2.5, 3 minutes listening to other people talk and then going, bleh, and then stopping again. And it didn't go very well, so I was crapping myself by the end of the day. But the next day, we did a courtroom scene where actually I had to learn a kind of monologue-ish bit. You know, by my standards anyway. And it went really well. And it just got better and better from there. So what I think I learned to get good at it, if I wanted to learn, it's there for me. You know, it's there to explore, because I think I didn't freeze, you know, in the way that I think a lot of musicians do. So we'll see. If I come back soon and they've only written me 3 more lines, then I know I'm wrong.
The actor George Michael may still feel a little out of place on the TV stage, but he's still completely at home on the musical one. He mounted his first tour in 15 years, selling out stadiums around Europe, and became the first artist to play at the new Wembley Stadium in London. It was a resounding triumph, although he was fined £130,000 for overrunning his show by 13 very expensive minutes. George had conquered Europe, but is he ready to tour America?
I'm really ready to tour America because I've never experienced being a nostalgia artist before. You know, I mean, of course there's a great deal of nostalgia, you know, involved in playing the tour in general, but these people have actually been listening to my music, you know, during that period of time in which America stopped listening to my music.
There's a huge curiosity factor, and because he's been away for so long, it's definitely going to read as fresh. He's certainly going to get an awful lot of media attention. There's certainly, I'm sure, is a core audience.
Also, I think they probably think I've run out of money, so they'll be blown away by the size of the show, you know.
Far from running out of money, George is one of the most generous artists in the music world.
The general public does not know that George is an extraordinary philanthropist. And I would say that outside of Elton John, he's probably the greatest philanthropist in popular music.
I remember years and years ago being a bit shocked. I was supposed to be the second biggest contributor in the country, because I remember thinking, well, everyone else is a bit tight then.
George Michael's philanthropy may be something he modestly keeps close to his chest, but one thing that he is more than happy to shout about is a body of work that will be listened to for generations to come.
I don't care if people never see my face in the next, you know, for the rest of this century. The body of work is safe now. You know, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, you know, people will remember what I've done and they'll still enjoy it. You know, I'm so lucky. I mean, people make brilliant music all the time that doesn't get played for 20 years, and for some reason mine just sits in that pocket where it does. And such an incredible thing to feel that you've achieved that. It's very possible that pop has had the best out of me that it's going to get. Even though I want to be making music till the day I die, it's perfectly possible to say, you know, 25 years on the charts is pretty good going, and you can't expect to be relevant forever, you know. But the body of work I've done already, 5 albums in 25 years, not exactly prolific, but I think pretty good in terms of quality.
He's a great songwriter. And you know, and all these experiences that he's had, all the things that the trauma and trials and tribulations that he's been through will, you know, I think they will be told in musical stories, you know.
George is likely to be remembered in 2 different ways in Britain and America. In Britain, he's a pop star, and in America, he's a soul boy.
There could be another act for him that could be surprisingly big.
More than anything else, I hope he's happy.
If I'm not, then I'm fooling myself very well, you know. If I'm not, then I'm doing a very good impersonation of happy, and I'm keeping it up.